Okay, so anyways, thank you for coming and welcome back. Yeah, so last week we learned about Elizabeth G. Britton, who is an American bryologist, who among other things helped found the New York Botanical Garden. And during that talk, I mentioned that she married Nathaniel L. Britton, who was also a botanist. And so I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit more about him today. And we do have specimens that were collected by Nathaniel here at UT. You can see here his initials NL Britton. And this specimen was collected with EG, so Elizabeth Britton, and also Percy Wilson, who was his assistant, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. This particular moss was collected in March of 1916 in Cuba on the Isle of Pines. And so I looked it up, and it's actually this kind of smaller island off the coast of the larger island in Cuba. And vicinity of Columbia. So Columbia is like a neighborhood, small town in here, this kind of north east corner of the island. And it is, most of the island is covered in pine trees, which is obviously kind of, you would guess from the name. But today it's actually called La Isla de la Juventud, or the Isle of Youth. It was renamed that in 1978. And in the past, it's actually been called by a number of names. So there are several indigenous names for the island. When Christopher Columbus came through, he called it La Evangelista. It's been called Parrot Island, Pirate Island, Treasure Island. And apparently accounts of the pirate activity in this region helped to inspire the classic books Treasure Island and Peter Pan, which I thought was kind of cool. So the specimen here is Isotrigium tenerum. It's also called delicate luster moss. And this is a small, shiny, light green creeping moss. Per the flora of North America, it grows in a range of habitats from dry wooded regions to swamps to wet roadside ditches. It can be found on the bases of trees, rotten logs, stumps, sandy soil, and sedimentary rocks. So pretty versatile moss. And here are a couple of pictures that I found of it out in the field. It's quite a pretty little moss. So Nathaniel Lord Britton was an American botanist and taxonomist. He was born in 1859 in New Dorp, which is actually a neighborhood on Staten Island in New York. I found these great pictures of him while he was growing up. And apparently his parents wanted him to go into a career in the church, but he was drawn to nature from a very early age. It was said that as a child, he knew the names of local plants in a way that seemed very mysterious to his parents. And he was encouraged by a neighbor, John J. Crook, who was a well-known naturalist, miner, and metallurgist. So in 1875, he enrolled at the Columbia School of Mines, Columbia College School of Mines, which today is Columbia University. He officially studied geology and mining, but botany became his main interest. However, there was not a lot of formal training or classes in botany at the college, so he was kind of largely self-taught. In 1879, he published his first botanical paper on the flora of Richmond County, which includes Staten Island. And he was just 20 years old at that time, and a lot of that work was done when he was a teenager. And he graduated that same year with his bachelor's. After graduation, he taught geology and botany at Columbia as an assistant instructor. He got his PhD in 1881 and continued to teach botany, geology, and zoology as an instructor, then an adjunct professor, and eventually a full professor by 1891. And as mentioned, there wasn't much of a botany department beforehand, so he really helped to build up that program. He also curated the college's herbarium, which had been neglected for quite some time. So he sorted a large backlog of specimens, worked to add IDs to many of them, and he added additional specimens from his own research, the research of others, and the herbarium tripled in size during the first 3 years. He also worked during some of that time as a botanist and assistant geologist with the Geological Survey of New Jersey. Throughout the 1880s, he collected extensively in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, and further afield in Michigan, Texas, New Mexico, and the Rocky Mountains. He collected fossils in the Wyoming Territory with Arthur Hollick, who was a paleobotanist, and published a number of papers on both plants and fossil plants. He had an early interest in the genus Cyperus, and the Cyperaceae family, which are commonly known as sedges. He published numerous papers and a new species in 1884. He was an active member of the Torrey Botanical Club, which he joined when he was 18. At their meetings, he presented many interesting plants that he had found, and he also shared duplicates of his own dried specimens with other members for their personal herbaria. He served as their librarian for 7 years and the editor of their bulletin for 9 years. He joined the American Association for the Advancement of Science and attended almost every meeting. Notably, he missed their 1885 meeting, which was explained in a note in the report, saying the club received the announcement that 2 of its former members, Dr. N.L. Britton and Miss Elizabeth G. Knight, both of New York City, had matrimonially united their fortunes on the preceding day, which accounted for their absence from the present meeting. The hearty congratulations of the club were forwarded to them by telegram. So the 2 had met as members of the Torrey Botanical Club and would collaborate on their botanical research for the rest of their lives. As we also mentioned last week, the pair traveled together to Kew Gardens in London in 1888. Nathaniel went there to use the reference collection to help identify some Bolivian specimens from this Henry Hurd Rusby. And he himself said that Elizabeth asked him, why couldn't we have something like this in New York? So when they returned to New York, Elizabeth described the Kew Gardens at a meeting of the Torrey Botanical Club. She was obviously persuasive because they agreed to appoint a special council, a special committee to see what could be done. That committee created a public appeal that they created and printed, and it listed 4 uses for a botanical garden, including first and foremost being purely scientific and educational use. After that, but still important, were pharmaceutical and horticultural uses, and then the general use of a place as agreeable resort for the public at large. So it's a great idea, but even that will take a lot of work. So one quote said, probably their dreams were made roseate by their enthusiasm and imagination of youth, since both of them were still in their 20s. Probably they never anticipated the difficulties with which they would meet with before their plans could be brought into reality. So the New York legislature approved establishing the garden in 1891, but they had to raise at least $250,000 as an endowment to fund it. So the Brittons led fundraising efforts. Nathaniel had some connections to the wealthy Vanderbilt family, but it said very few of them had wealthy associates who might become interested. Again, it was Dr. Britton who succeeded in inducing those few to initiate a campaign for funds. For years, the attempt persisted, but the work lagged, and it was not until a determined group of women, led by Mrs. Britton, took to the warpath that the minimum endowment of $250,000 was secured, and of this, only the income might be used. So they got the funds. 250 acres of Bronx Park were set aside for the garden, and that would increase to 400 acres later on. By 1896, construction began, but there were many, many more years of hard work and fundraising as it grew. Nathaniel left Columbia College to become the first director of the Botanical Garden, and Elizabeth became the unofficial curator of mosses. And the first board of managers included influential figures like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. So Britton held the position of director until he retired in 1929. And in those 33 years, he developed their scientific research program, helped build a library of over 40,000 books, and an herbarium of 1.7 million specimens from around the world. Ongoing fundraising efforts grew their original endowment to $2.5 million with over 2,000 members. He launched a number of publications from the garden and collaborated with other institutions, including the Scientific Alliance of New York. And he also founded public education and horticultural programs, very busy. There's another great quote. Dr. Britton's accomplishment in the establishment of our botanical garden is not likely to fail of appreciation by future generations, but they might easily fail to appreciate the difficulties attending such a vast work on such insufficient resources. Looking back on the conditions that confronted the enterprise, they seem appalling and the undertaking hopeless. Yet, here is the garden, just pride of a nation. So he directed fieldwork and research throughout North America, South America, the Philippines, and the West Indies. He and Elizabeth worked extensively in the Caribbean, visiting annually over the severe New York winters, starting in 1902, and they financed a lot of that personally. The U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico in 1899, and they also had citizens and investments in Cuba. So Britain encouraged the New York Botanical Garden staff to study in that region, and also bought specimens from local botanists. He was accompanied by his wife on most of these trips, and also Percy Wilson, who was his personal assistant. And so this is our trio from the label, from our original label here. And Percy joined the New York Botanical Gardens at the age of 20 with no experience in botany, and ended up working there for 40 years. Britain supported teams with interests different from his own. So he focused on vascular plants, but included people studying non-vascular plants, fungi, and algae. And these efforts helped the garden compile approximately 150,000 specimens from the West Indies. So last week, I found some pictures of Nathaniel in the field. These are him in the Bahamas, in Puerto Rico. This one is him and Elizabeth in Cuba. I really liked this picture of some of his crew in 1920. So you can see the couple, Nathaniel, Elizabeth here on the end. Britton wrote up his West Indies findings in several volumes of floras, including Bermuda, Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and a catalog of the flora of Cuba, which he wrote with a French-born Cuban botanist, Brother Leon. And these resources included information on over 11,000 species. He was a prolific writer, so his motto was known to be "get it into print." He believed in making findings available for others as quickly as possible instead of kind of sitting on them. So he would just publish appendices as needed with new information when it came. These are the first and last pages of his bibliography. So you can see from 1877 into the 1930s, there are 43 pages of books and papers that he wrote in his bibliography. I could not post enough slides for that. Some of his most popular works include the illustrated flora of the northern United States, Canada, and the British possessions, which he wrote with Addison Brown, who was an amateur botanist. It was popularly known as the Brown and Britton Illustrated Flora, and was the main flora for more than 50 years, selling thousands of copies. The guide was really popular because the illustrations were really helpful for students and amateurs. And there's a legend that said that while working on the book, he left Columbia College on Friday evenings with a bundle of herbarium specimens under his arm, retired to his old home in Staten Island, and there worked almost continually until Monday morning. And his tireless work ethic is an ongoing theme, which we'll see. He wrote the guide North American Trees with J.A. Schaefer, and his magnum opus is considered his work on the family Cactaceae, or the cacti, which he wrote with Joseph Nelson Rose from the Carnegie Institute. It was published in 4 volumes, included a wealth of photographs, diagrams, and really beautiful illustrations that were made by an English botanical illustrator named Mary Emily Eaton. It was a huge undertaking, and it's quoted that in this work, 124 genera and about 1,237 species of this perplexing family are described. No matter what future botanists may attempt or achieve in their consideration of this great family of plants, this Britton and Rose monograph forms a datum plane from which all future work must proceed. He was very interested in taxonomy, and his name is associated with over 4,000 names in Tropicos. Very practically, one source said that he got support for the garden by naming plants after wealthy donors. And I did find at least one genus, Carnegia, is for saguaro cactuses, presumably named after the Carnegie family. And speaking of taxonomy, there's one other big highlight, or perhaps controversy, that I will share. He was at the heart of a very large debate about botanical rules for botanical nomenclature. So as you may know, a species can be called by several common names or local names. So for example, this moss is called red bog moss or small red peat moss. And again, if you think of vascular plants, some of them have tons of different common names or local regional names, but it should only have one scientific name, so unique for each plant. So here you can see this, its scientific name is Sphagnum capillifolium, but often the same plant might have been given more than one scientific name described by different people unknowingly. And the question arises of which one of those names should be the name and which one is or should be considered synonyms. So there are also problems with homonyms. So sometimes 2 different plants or species would be given the same name, which does happen. There's also a question of tautonyms, where whether or not you can have a genus and a species being the same word, whether or not you should allow this. And also too, if a species gets moved to a new genus, do you have to keep the species name, or can you change it? So a lot of scenarios to try to standardize. And for a little bit of background, binomial name, so a genus and species was first developed by the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. But the first formal naming rules weren't prepared until Swiss botanist Alphonse de Candolle proposed them in 1867, and they were accepted at the International Botanical Congress in Paris. So they were called the Paris Code. But Britain and the Tory Botanical Club disagreed with some of those rules. So they formed a committee to create a botanical nomenclature system for North America in 1891 and 92. And it was called the American Code or the Rochester Code. And they began to publish using that criteria. But not everyone agreed. It split the botanic community in the US into two hostile camps. Largely, it was the Great Herbarium at Harvard University versus the Columbia College, New York Botanical Gardens. And this feud lasted for more than 30 years. It also started debates in Europe. So a Berlin Code was created in 1897, which actually was more similar to the American Code. And it was also discussed at the International Botanical Congresses in 1905 and 1910. And the code that was developed there internationally slowly replaced kind of all the other codes, but it's still debated today. And several aspects of the accepted code now did come from the American Code. So interesting kind of tangle there. He was a member and served on a very large number of scientific organizations. I will not read through all of these, but you can see very active. And he met several notable people. So I found this cool picture. This is Britain here, and he's with Thomas Edison. So interesting time. He retired from the garden in 1929, but stayed quite busy. He spent his last years working on the Puerto Rican flora, but left it unfinished when he passed away in June of 1934, just 4 months after his wife Elizabeth had died. And several sources said that her death was an emotional shock from which he never recovered, which is kind of sad. And so he bequeathed half of his estate to a number of scientific organizations that he was involved with. And honor-wise, so 69 taxa of living and fossil plants are named after him. And there are 2 that were named conjointly for him and for Elizabeth. There's a botanical journal called Britonia. As I mentioned last week, Mount Britton in Puerto Rico was named for both of the Brittons. And obviously there's, and reference herbarium at the New York Botanical Gardens is called the Britton Herbarium, or was named that in 1935. Obviously there are a lot of other awards, etc. I won't list them all out. It would take too long, but his work was definitely appreciated during and after his lifetime. All of his personal archives and papers are also stored at the Mertz Library at the New York Botanical Gardens. Specimen-wise, again, these are the same totals from last week, so it's for him and Elizabeth. It's kind of hard to pull them apart with the searching. Obviously, he was more focused on vascular plants, so probably a larger number of those are his. The bryophytes are more Elizabeth, but there are a lot that they collected together, like this one you can see with both of their names on it. So yeah, so that is Nathaniel L. Britton. I'll again end with a quote saying, the New York Botanical Garden is a constant reminder of the energy, wisdom, scientific attainments, and the organization and administrative ability of Nathaniel Lord Britton. His name is indelibly associated with the annals of botany of North and South America and the West Indies. No monument is necessary to perpetuate his name for him in association with the great institution he established. It may truly be said in Latin for, if you seek a monument, look around you. So he left obviously a great legacy with him, and that together is Nathaniel L. Britton and Elizabeth Britton. Again, a really impressive and productive botanical couple. So thanks again for listening.
Thank you again.